It started with a plate of cold pancakes and a radio left playing in the kitchen. On a January morning in 1954, the Harper family simply vanished from their farmhouse in rural Iowa. No one saw them leave. No one heard a thing. The front door was locked from the inside. The coats were still hanging by the door, and the snow outside was perfectly untouched, except for one set of footprints leading in. None ever came out. What happened inside that house would become one of the most haunting mysteries in the county's history, a story that slept in silence for 21 years, until a storm tore the land open and exposed what had been buried all along. Earl Harper was a quiet, disciplined man. A war veteran turned farmer, he lived for his land and family. Margaret was known for her warm smile, kind nature, and the apple pies she brought to every church gathering. Their 9-year-old son Luke was a thoughtful boy who loved puzzles and always asked questions no one expected. The Harpers lived off a gravel road few traveled unless they had a reason. Their home was modest but tidy. A white farmhouse with faded shutters and a red barn behind it that Earl never let anyone go near. That winter was colder than most. By mid-January, snow lay thick on the ground. When Helen Reeves, a neighbor 2 fields over, noticed no chimney smoke or lights from the Harper home for 3 days, she felt something was wrong. On January 11th, she phoned Sheriff Randall White. By noon, he and a deputy arrived. The front door was locked. No one answered. They forced it open with a pry bar and stepped into a scene that made both men pause. The kitchen table was set. 3 plates sat untouched. The pancakes were cold. A half-full coffee pot sat on the stove. Margaret's apron hung neatly on a hook. Luke's school book was on the floor, flipped open. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. Upstairs, the beds were made. The closets full. No suitcases had been packed. The fireplace was out, but wood sat untouched nearby. The house felt abandoned mid-sentence. There was no sign of a struggle. No blood, no forced entry. Just stillness so complete it unsettled even the seasoned sheriff. Outside, snow blanketed the fields. The only tracks led from Earl's truck to the front porch. No tracks led away. There were no tire marks. No boot prints from Margaret or Luke. The barn was still locked, its padlock covered in frost. Nothing seemed disturbed. Search efforts began that same evening. Locals came with dogs and lanterns. Authorities from Des Moines joined in. Planes scanned overhead. Volunteers walked frozen creek beds and fields. But there were no signs. No clothing. No notes. No footprints past the porch. Nothing. News of the disappearance traveled fast. The Harpers became the focus of front pages and radio stories across the state. Theories came and went. Some believed they had been kidnapped. Others claimed they ran away. A few whispered about the barn, wondering what secrets Earl had kept behind its locked door. The investigation continued for months, but every trail went cold. Nothing led to the truth. By that summer, the case was shelved. The farmhouse was boarded up. The sheriff kept the keys, unsure whether it was now evidence or a monument to something no one understood. Over time, the house weathered, shingles fell, the paint peeled, the barn darkened with age and leaned into the prairie wind. Kids dared each other to sneak in. They said if you stood still in the kitchen long enough, you could hear the radio playing. Some swore they saw movement upstairs, but most who went in came out silent. It became the kind of place no one wanted to talk about directly. Years passed. The story faded but never disappeared. Locals remembered the name, the boy, the breakfast, the silence. It became more legend than memory. A chapter people skipped when they told their family histories. Still, nothing changed at the property. The barn remained sealed. The door was never opened. Earl had made sure of that. He had installed the lock himself just 2 days before the family vanished. No key was ever found. Then came the storm. In March of 1975, high winds tore across eastern Iowa. Trees fell, roofs ripped away. On the Harper property, a large oak behind the barn was uprooted and slammed into the fence line. When county crews came to remove it days later, they found something lodged beneath the roots. A rusted metal box, partially crushed but still sealed. Inside was a folded piece of paper, protected in waxed paper. It was a drawing. Crayons on yellowed paper showed a boy standing beside a tall figure near the barn. The man held a shovel. The ground below him was dark. The sky above was scribbled in black. The boy had 3 eyes, 2 where they should be, 1 in the center of his forehead. At the bottom, a name was written in uneven, childish letters. Luke. After 21 years, the first clue had finally surfaced. The case was reopened. Investigators returned to the property. The house still stood. The barn remained locked. But for the first time in 2 decades, someone was asking again. What happened to the Harper family that morning in 1954? And what did Luke see before they disappeared? The land had been silent for too long. Now it was ready to speak. When investigators reopened the Harper case in 1975, they began not with the house or the barn, but with county records. They searched property deeds, tax documents, and wills looking for any missed detail from years before. In the dusty archives of the courthouse, tucked inside a folder marked Harper Estate, they found something unusual. Earl Harper had updated his will in October of 1953, just 3 months before the disappearance. Most of the contents were routine. He left the house and land to Margaret and guardianship of Luke to his sister, who lived in Illinois. But one clause stood out. It stated clearly that the barn on their property was not to be dismantled, entered, or significantly altered for 25 years following his death or absence. There was no explanation, no legal justification, just a strict instruction with no exceptions. Investigators had never seen the clause before, as it had not been considered relevant during the initial search in 1954. Now, with the discovery of Luke's drawing, the barn took on a new kind of weight. This was no longer just a missing person case. It was something deeper, something hidden, and Earl Harper had tried to keep it that way. They turned their attention to the hardware store in town, hoping to trace the padlock Earl had placed on the barn just days before he vanished. The store was still in business, operated by the same family. The current owner was the son of the man who had run it in the 50s. He remembered the Harpers vaguely, mostly that Earl had come in occasionally for seed and fencing. They pulled the old ledgers from the back office and scanned for transactions made in early January 1954. What they found was even stranger than the will. A sale had been recorded 2 days before the disappearance for a heavy-duty padlock and chain matching the exact model still found on the barn door. But the signature on the purchase was not Earl Harper's. In fact, the name signed did not match anyone local. There was no phone number listed, no address. Just a cash payment and an unfamiliar name. The clerk at the time had made a small note beside it, simply writing something seemed off. Investigators now had 2 facts that could no longer be ignored. Someone had locked the barn just before the family disappeared, and Earl had gone out of his way to ensure no one would open it until long after he was gone. The new sheriff, a man named Cole Merritt, wanted to open the barn immediately. But legal complications around the will meant they had to proceed carefully. While waiting for clearance, he sent officers to speak with anyone still alive who had known the Harpers well. Most had moved or passed on. But one man remained living just a few miles down the road. Walter Greaves had been their closest neighbor in the 50s. He had been interviewed briefly in 1954 and had offered no useful information at the time. Now retired and living alone, Walter greeted the officers with polite confusion. He said he remembered the family, but had not spoken to them much. He mentioned that Earl kept to himself was a good father and a decent man. But one of the officers, while making small talk, noticed a journal on Walter's bookshelf, labeled 1954. When asked if they could look at it, Walter became tense. He refused and ended the conversation. Days later, investigators returned with a warrant. Walter was gone. The house was empty, and the journal had vanished along with him. Sheriff Merritt now had more questions than answers. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep people away from the barn. The lock had not been purchased by Earl, despite the impression given. The will had included an unusual restriction with no legal context. And now the only man who might have known more had disappeared after 21 years of silence. The sheriff ordered aerial photographs of the property taken during the storm cleanup to be enlarged and analyzed. Nothing conclusive appeared, but one image showed that the fallen tree had unearthed more than just a box. In the exposed roots barely visible was something that looked like a broken plank. Investigators returned to the scene and dug around the roots again. They found more wood, old and splintered. Part of a structure. Something buried. It was not attached to the barn. It had been underground beneath the soil, possibly for decades. They could not yet determine what it had once been. But it was clear now that Earl's warning was not paranoia. He had been protecting something. Whether it was to keep others safe or to keep something hidden was still uncertain. With Walter Greaves gone, the sheriff's office turned their attention to what they could still access. They returned to Walter's house with a second warrant and began a full search of the property. The house was small and smelled of dust and kerosene. It had not been lived in for days. Dishes sat in the sink. The refrigerator was nearly empty. In the upstairs bedroom, an old dresser had been emptied. Clothes were missing. A suitcase was gone. But the most important find came in the attic. Hidden beneath a stack of newspapers and wrapped in cloth was a collection of old journals, most written in the same precise handwriting. One of them, dated 1954, had a dog-eared page marked January 11th. Sheriff Merritt opened it and read a single line that brought a chill to the room. It said plainly that he heard the screams again. That line stood alone, written in darker ink as if it had been added later. There was no mention of what came before or after. But the implication was enough. Walter had heard something the night the Harpers vanished, and for reasons unknown he never spoke of it until he wrote it down for himself. Further down in that same journal, entries from previous years raised new concerns. In early spring of 1952, Walter had written about being arrested for trespassing on the Harper property. That part was known, but the journal revealed details never shared with police. Walter claimed he had not intended to steal or destroy. He had gone to the Harper barn because he believed something was wrong with the boy. He wrote that he often saw Luke walking around alone, near the barn, looking over his shoulder. One entry described how Luke once stood at the edge of the property line, staring into the trees for nearly an hour. Walter insisted he felt the child was not safe, and that Earl had become withdrawn during those months. He described the father as changing no longer friendly, often tense. None of this was in the original police records. At the time, Walter had said nothing of concern, but now it appeared he had been watching the family much closer than anyone realized. Whether out of genuine worry or something more troubling remained unclear. Investigators tracked down the arrest report from 1952 and found that Walter had indeed been charged for trespassing, though the charges were later dropped. Earl had requested that nothing further be pursued. The record included a short statement from Earl stating the matter had been a misunderstanding. He said Walter had mistaken a fox for a child and had entered the property during the night, scaring his wife. Nothing more had come of it. But in light of the journal entries, the sheriff now viewed the incident differently. Walter had inserted himself into the Harper family's life in ways that no one fully understood. He had lied to police. He had kept a detailed written account of their routines, and now he had vanished the moment questions resurfaced. The possibility that he had been involved directly in their disappearance began to gain traction within the department. The discovery of the journals led investigators to search the surrounding area for signs of Walter. They spoke to nearby towns, checked bus stations, and reviewed recent hotel bookings under his name. A tip came in from a motel 2 towns over. A man matching Walter's description had checked in under a different name and paid in cash. The room was already cleared out, but the clerk remembered he had carried several books and written constantly in a small notebook. They found no forwarding address. No additional journals were left behind. Walter had simply moved on again, just as he had after 1954. Authorities now believed he had been keeping secrets for over 2 decades and had prepared to disappear if those secrets ever came close to being revealed. What troubled Sheriff Merritt most was not Walter's disappearance itself, but the idea that someone had known what happened that night and had chosen silence. The drawing found beneath the tree. The will preventing access to the barn. The strange lock, purchased under a false name. And now the man who claimed to have heard screams and been concerned for the boy's safety was gone. The case was growing darker. Motives remained unclear. Was Walter protecting someone or hiding from something? His notes suggested he believed something dangerous had occurred on that property, something beyond what neighbors would ever understand. His quiet life, his avoidance of town events, and his fading into obscurity had not been random. He had been waiting, watching, and preparing. And just when someone got too close, he was gone. The journals gave Sheriff Merritt a new understanding of the Harper case, but he still had no evidence that tied Walter to anything beyond suspicion. Then, a second storm rolled through in early April, less violent than the last, but strong enough to scatter the rotting barn siding and tear away a portion of the foundation. While examining the damage, a crewman noticed something sticking out from the disturbed soil near the tree stump. He bent down and pulled free a rusted tin box no bigger than a lunch pail. It was dented on one side, sealed with wire, and wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was another drawing, faded but intact. The paper had yellowed with time, and the crayon strokes were light. The picture showed a boy near the barn, small in scale compared to a looming adult figure. The adult held a shovel, and in the earth near his feet was a dark oval shape. What struck the sheriff most was the boy's face. Again, 3 eyes were drawn, the third one placed high on the forehead. It was the same style, the same name signed below in shaky letters, Luke. It was not a duplicate. This was another original. The positioning of the drawing led the sheriff to consider whether the box had been buried deliberately. The location suggested it had been hidden before the storm, possibly even before the Harpers disappeared. No one could explain why a child would draw such an image or why he would hide it. Sheriff Merritt brought in a psychologist who specialized in analyzing child behavior. She studied the drawing and remarked on the detail. The proportions were unusual for a 9-year-old. The emotional tone suggested fear and confusion. She noted the third eye may not have been literal, but rather a representation of awareness or knowledge beyond a child's usual experience. She also pointed out that the adult figure had no face, just an outline of a head and shoulders completely blank. That absence unnerved everyone in the room. The sheriff asked whether trauma could cause a child to draw something like that. The psychologist replied that children often reveal what they cannot say in pictures, sometimes what they fear, sometimes what they have witnessed. This was not just a child's imagination. It was memory turned into lines. The sheriff ordered the area near the barn to be dug up carefully. He wanted to know what lay beneath the surface and whether any other items had been buried. Workers began removing sections of earth by hand. The soil was dark and soft in places unusually rich for that part of the county. After 2 days, they uncovered fragments of what appeared to be wooden beams, followed by metal hinges and bent nails. A portion of rotted stairs emerged next, leading nowhere, cut off by soil and time. It became clear they were looking at the remains of an old cellar, perhaps a storm shelter. But it was not connected to the house or marked on any property map. The sheriff called in a structural engineer who confirmed the wood had been untreated and likely constructed before the current barn. It had been sealed off long ago. Someone had wanted it forgotten. The sheriff stood over the edge and felt the air shift. It was cooler the way air gets when it escapes from a sealed space. They were getting closer. As the workers cleared more dirt, they exposed a narrow opening reinforced with stones. A single board covered the mouth, nailed down with fresh nails that were not consistent with the age of the wood. These nails were newer, made with modern zinc coating. They had not rusted like the others. That meant someone had sealed this space far more recently than the original structure would suggest, possibly within the last decade. Sheriff Merritt bent down and ran his fingers along the board. The soil had been disturbed, not by the storm but by human hands. He gave the order to remove the board. When they did, a shallow tunnel revealed itself just a few feet long, ending at what looked like a trap door. It was wood, faded, dry, but intact. And like the board above it, it had also been secured from the outside with clean nails and no sign of decay. The sheriff stood still and said nothing. Everyone around him waited. No one wanted to say what they were all thinking, that something had been hidden, and someone had returned years later to hide it again. With the discovery of the sealed cellar under the barn, Sheriff Merritt knew he could no longer delay action. A court order was secured that allowed full access to the barn and any structures found beneath it. While waiting for the paperwork to clear, a man named Travis Wilcox contacted the sheriff's office. Travis had recently inherited the Harper property through a distant family connection and had plans to restore the barn and convert the land into a pasture for cattle. He was unaware of the recent developments. When informed, he agreed to halt his plans, but admitted he had already begun minor repairs on the barn after the storm damage. Travis mentioned something odd. While replacing a section of the rotting floor near the rear wall, he found a section of boards that seemed newer than the rest. The nails were clean. The boards were dry and did not match the weathered timber surrounding them. He thought maybe someone had tried patching the floor in the past, but decided not to disturb it further. When asked exactly where he had found them, Travis pointed to the same corner near where the trapdoor had been uncovered. That was enough to reopen the barn fully. Under the supervision of law enforcement, the barn floor was carefully dismantled. Workers removed planks one at a time, revealing a patch of earth with clear outlines of cut stone forming a square perimeter. At the center was the sealed trapdoor, the same one discovered days earlier from the outside tunnel. The structure had been built deliberately layered in such a way that it was nearly invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Sheriff Merritt crouched beside it, running his palm across the surface. The trapdoor had no handle, only a small notch in one corner. They used crowbars to lift it free. The wood cracked but held together. Beneath it was a short wooden ladder leading into a root cellar no larger than a single-room shed. The air smelled of earth and rot. A flashlight beam pierced the darkness, revealing something none of them expected. 3 forms lay in the dust. Human remains positioned side by side, bones bound at the wrists with coarse rope. There was no sign of coffins, no padding or care. The bodies had been laid there and left. Deputies descended carefully, stepping around the remains. The cellar walls were stone, old and uneven, clearly hand-laid. On the far end of the space sat a rusted metal bucket, long empty. Near it was a length of rope, and what appeared to be an oil lantern shattered. The remains themselves were fragile, but mostly intact. Each skull bore a small hole at the temple, clean and round. Forensics would later confirm what everyone suspected. These had been execution-style killings. The medical examiner was called in to remove the remains. Everything was documented. Photographs were taken. Samples collected. The cellar was secured. Investigators left the scene shaken. The evidence pointed to a deliberate act, not an accident or hasty crime. Someone had tied the victims, shot them carefully, and buried them under their own barn, and someone else had come back years later to seal it again. Whether to protect the secret or preserve the evidence remained unclear. News broke within 24 hours. Local headlines read, "Harper's found under barn and mystery of 1954 reopened." Journalists from across the state came to cover the story. Sheriff Merritt refused interviews. He focused instead on identifying the remains officially. The forensic team worked day and night. Clothing fragments were recovered, though most had decayed beyond recognition. A belt buckle engraved with initials matched one given to Earl Harper as a wedding gift. A small locket still holding a faded photograph was identified by Margaret's sister, and the smallest skeleton had dental patterns consistent with a child of 9. DNA testing, though slower at the time, eventually confirmed what the sheriff already knew. The bodies belonged to Earl Margaret and Luke Harper. The family that vanished in 1954 had never left their home. They had been beneath it all along. Sheriff Merritt stood in silence when the results came in. He had never fully believed the family had run away, but knowing they had died so close to where they lived was something else entirely. It changed the case. It changed how people in the town spoke about that house. The final piece in that chapter came when the trapdoor was examined more closely. Along its edge, etched faintly into the wood, were markings that had gone unnoticed before. A series of shallow cuts. Not initials, not symbols. Just a child's name. Luke. It had been scratched in several times like a child practicing their handwriting. Whether it was done before the cellar was sealed or after remained uncertain, but its presence was undeniable. Luke had been aware. Perhaps he had even been the last to die. Sheriff Merritt kept the trapdoor in the evidence room for weeks before it was sent for preservation. He returned to the barn one final time and stood inside the empty frame. With the cellar now exposed, the barn felt different, hollowed. The silence was no longer mysterious. It was heavy, filled with what had always been there. After the bodies were recovered, Sheriff Merritt ordered a forensic examination to determine how long the Harpers had been buried. The hope was to confirm that the murders occurred in 1954, as previously believed. But the results only deepened the mystery. The remains showed signs of preservation that did not align with being buried for over 2 decades. The bones were far less decayed than expected, and soil samples taken from around the cellar revealed recent disturbances. When tested for decomposition markers, the forensic pathologist concluded that the remains had likely been placed there not 21 years ago, but closer to 2 years ago. This shocked the entire investigative team. The Harpers had vanished in 1954, but evidence suggested their bodies had been relocated and buried under the barn sometime around 1973. The idea that someone had returned to the Harper property nearly 20 years after their disappearance carried the bodies there and resealed the trapdoor with fresh nails raised horrifying questions. Who had been in possession of their remains all that time, and why bring them back? The sheriff found himself reevaluating everything he thought he knew. This was no longer a mystery of a missing family. It was a planned cover-up. DNA confirmation arrived shortly after the initial forensic report. All 3 bodies were definitively identified as Earl Margaret and Luke Harper. That removed any remaining doubt. Sheriff Merritt felt both relief and a new burden. The case was no longer a question of whether the family had died. Now the question was how they had remained hidden for so long, and who had taken such deliberate steps to conceal the truth. Investigators revisited property records searching for evidence of who might have had access to the land around 1973. The Harper home had remained vacant for years. Ownership had shifted between county records and distant relatives, but in 1972, someone had filed a permit to clear fallen trees and repair the barn's roof. The name on the permit was listed as William G. Reeves. No one in the town remembered him. The address given was a vacant lot in Missouri. Fingerprints on the permit were smudged. When cross-referenced with earlier documents, authorities noticed something unusual. The handwriting on the permit matched a signature from an older arrest record. That record belonged to Walter Greaves. The connection was now undeniable. Walter had returned to the Harper property nearly 2 decades after the disappearance, and he had done so under a false name. This revelation changed the trajectory of the investigation. Sheriff Merritt ordered a full background check on Walter Greaves. What they found confirmed a long-held suspicion. Walter Greaves had not always been Walter Greaves. His original name was Gregory Harper. He had been born in Illinois and was the older brother of Earl Harper. Gregory had enlisted in the Army in the late 1930s and was declared dead in a house fire in 1939. But the records of his death were incomplete. No body had been recovered. The coroner at the time had been later convicted of falsifying documents in exchange for bribes. Gregory had faked his own death and assumed the identity of Walter Greaves, a drifter who had died in a train accident and never been claimed. Using forged documents, Gregory began a new life in Iowa, just 1 county away from where his brother lived. No one had ever connected the two because the family had never spoken of Gregory again. Sheriff Merritt stared at the files for a long time. The motive remained unclear, but the presence of a long-lost brother living under a new name, returning years later to rebury the bodies of his own kin, was no longer a theory. It was fact. Investigators now believed the original murders occurred in 1954, and that Gregory posing as Walter had either committed them or helped cover them up. When questions began to resurface in the early 1970s, he had returned to the property, unearthed the remains from wherever they had been hidden, and buried them under the barn, where no one was supposed to look for 25 years. The clause in Earl's will now took on new meaning. It had likely been written under duress or as part of some arrangement. Perhaps Earl had known his brother's secret and tried to protect Luke. Perhaps he had failed. Sheriff Merritt felt the weight of lost years pressing down on him. They had come close to the truth once, then lost it in legal paper and silence. Now they were seeing the pieces fit together not in a single answer, but in patterns of secrecy and betrayal. The cellar beneath the barn had held not just remains, but the timeline of a crime that had been carefully erased and rewritten over 2 decades. With Gregory Harper exposed as the man who had lived under the name Walter Greaves, Sheriff Merritt pressed forward to reconstruct the timeline of events. The key question remained unanswered. Where had the bodies of Earl, Margaret, and Luke been stored between 1954 and 1973? Forensics offered one more unsettling clue. While the condition of the remains suggested a burial date around 1973, certain details contradicted this assumption. Small tissue fragments recovered from the base of the skulls indicated the bodies had not decomposed naturally. Experts suspected they had been preserved in a controlled environment, not embalmed, but kept in a cold and sealed space. It was as if someone had tried to keep the bodies intact until they could be buried properly. That someone was now almost certainly Gregory. Investigators combed through old land record storage unit leases and rural property permits in the surrounding counties. They found a rental under the name William G. Reeves listed in 1955 for a meat locker in a closed-down butcher shop 40 miles away. The unit had been sealed in 1972 and torn down during renovations in 1974. No one had known what had been inside. It was now likely that the Harper remains had been hidden there. The sheriff's team spoke to former employees of the old butcher shop. Most had passed away or moved, but one man remembered the name. He said the tenant rarely came around, usually late at night. Always wore gloves and never stayed long. The man assumed it was someone storing game meat. He had never thought twice about it. This lined up with the working theory that Gregory had used the locker to preserve the bodies until he felt it was safe to rebury them. Sheriff Merritt began to understand just how long this deception had been maintained. Gregory had watched over the remains of his brother's family for almost 2 decades. Whether out of guilt, fear, or twisted affection, he had refused to let them decay. Instead, he had planned every step. He forged permits. He returned to the barn. He nailed shut the trapdoor with clean nails and hoped the clause in the will would keep others away until he was gone. The pieces fit with a kind of precision that felt disturbing. This had never been an accident. It had been an orchestration. The sheriff looked again at the Harper will and noticed something he had missed before. The clause about the barn had been added in a separate ink, slightly darker, less faded. It had likely been inserted after the rest of the will was written. When the handwriting was analyzed again, the results were conclusive. The clause about the barn was not written by Earl Harper. It was forged. The handwriting matched Gregory's. This confirmed that even the legal document meant to protect the barn had been part of the cover-up. Earl had either never seen it or had signed it under pressure. Sheriff Merritt wondered what kind of manipulation had occurred in those final days before the family vanished. Had Earl known the truth about his brother's identity? Had he tried to protect his wife and child, but failed? These were questions they might never fully answer. But what was now certain was that Gregory had orchestrated every legal and physical safeguard to prevent the cellar from being discovered before he died. He had planned to take the truth with him. Only the storm had ruined that plan. In search of further proof, investigators traced Gregory's last known movements before his final disappearance. Bank records showed small withdrawals across 3 towns. Motel registrations matched the same handwriting. He had stayed within a 100-mile radius, always moving, always watching. One of the last places he visited was a county records office in a nearby town. There, he had requested property maps of the Harper land, specifically old topography charts that predated the barn. The clerk on duty had not remembered the man's name, but when shown a photo, he confirmed it. That meant Gregory had returned not just once, but multiple times. He had checked on the property. He had confirmed that no one had disturbed the cellar. Perhaps he had intended to return one final time to move the bodies again, but the storm came first. The box with Luke's drawing surfaced, and with it a truth he could no longer bury. Investigators pieced together a chilling timeline. The Harpers died in 1954. Their bodies were stored for 18 years in a meat locker. Then, in 1973, Gregory returned to rebury them and forged a clause to keep others away for another 25 years. With so many questions still unanswered, Sheriff Merritt returned to the barn one final time. The structure was old and fragile, but he believed there might still be something left behind. He asked the forensic team to recheck the walls, especially near the area where the trapdoor had been found. After a careful inspection, one of the deputies noticed a slight, hollow sound when knocking against a section of the back wall. They removed the panel and discovered a narrow compartment no wider than a bread box. Inside was a tin container dusty and sealed with twine. When opened, it revealed a stack of vintage film reels, each labeled by hand, with dates ranging from 1952 to 1954. Sheriff Merritt took the reels back to the station and arranged for them to be viewed using a projector kept in the evidence room. The first reel showed grainy black and white footage of the Harper family. There were no opening titles or explanations, just candid moments. Earl chopping wood, Margaret hanging laundry, Luke feeding chickens. All of it appeared to be filmed from a distance. None of the subjects looked at the camera. They seemed unaware they were being watched. Each reel continued the same way. Unedited scenes of the Harper family going about their daily routines. There were no holidays or celebrations, just fragments of ordinary life recorded in silence. But the closer Sheriff Merritt watched, the more unsettling it became. The angles were sometimes too close. The camera captured moments inside the house through windows. Margaret brushing Luke's hair, Earl dozing in a chair with a book open on his chest. The camera operator was never seen, but at one point a shadow crossed the frame. It was tall, narrow, unmistakably human. On the third reel, the sheriff paused. The footage showed the family seated for dinner. The table was neatly set. Margaret passed a dish to Luke. Then, for a brief moment, the glass window behind them reflected a man's face. The reflection was faint, but clear enough. Sheriff Merritt had seen that face in old photographs. It was Gregory Harper, the man who had filmed them, the man who had lived next door and watched them for years without their knowledge. The sheriff turned his focus to identifying the location from which the recordings had been made. The angles suggested they had been filmed from a tree line or from inside another structure. Investigators searched the area again and discovered the remnants of an old shed behind the barn long since collapsed. A partial foundation remained, along with rusted hinges and a broken window frame. This would have provided a perfect view of the Harper home and barn. Beneath the debris, they found a hidden crawl space. Inside were rotted boxes, empty film canisters, and a notebook, its pages stained and brittle. The writing inside matched Gregory's. He had documented the dates and contents of each reel, referring to them not as memories, but as evidence. Phrases like daily compliance and child's condition appeared throughout. The sheriff read every page and understood what Gregory had been doing. He had not just watched his brother's family. He had studied them, recorded them, evaluated them. For what purpose remained unclear. But it was clear now that he had been obsessed, possibly disturbed, and that his role in their lives had always been hidden in plain sight. Investigators expanded the search to the farmhouse itself. It had remained largely untouched since the family disappeared. Dust covered every surface. Furniture sat as it had on that winter day in 1954. Behind a loose panel in the upstairs hallway, they discovered another compartment. This one held a roll of undeveloped film and a small envelope. Inside the envelope was a photograph of Luke, not with his parents, but standing alone beside the barn. His face was somber. In the background, a shovel leaned against the wall. The expression on this boy's face was distant, unreadable. On the back of the photo was a date, January 10th, 1954, the day before the family vanished. Sheriff Merritt realized this might have been the last image ever taken of Luke while he was alive. The photograph and film were sent to a lab for enhancement. The developed film revealed similar content to the reels, more silent footage of the barn and surrounding property. No voice, no context. Just the quiet documentation of a family being watched by someone who never stopped filming. After reviewing the film reels and the photo of Luke, Sheriff Merritt turned his focus to anything that might reveal why Gregory Harper had committed these acts. With no living relatives left on Gregory's side, the sheriff searched public records for any financial ties or storage rentals. One of the deputies uncovered a safety deposit box in Gregory's name at a small bank located 2 towns away. The bank manager said it had not been accessed since the early 1970s. With proper authorization, the box was opened under official supervision. Inside were only 2 items: a folded letter sealed in a waxy envelope and a pocket knife with initials carved into the handle. The letter was addressed simply with the words "Read if we disappear." Sheriff Merritt unfolded the letter slowly. The paper had yellowed and the ink had faded slightly, but the message was still clear. It was written in Earl Harper's handwriting. The contents stunned everyone present. In it, Earl wrote that if something ever happened to the family, then Walter knew why. The letter ended with a chilling line. "They will never believe it. He wears the same face as my brother who died in '39. The sheriff read the letter twice, then a 3rd time. Earl had suspected that Walter Greaves was not who he claimed to be. The reference to the same face made sense now. Earl's brother Gregory had faked his death and reappeared as Walter. Whether Earl had recognized him right away or only later was unclear. The sheriff took the letter to the forensics department for verification. Handwriting experts confirmed the note had been written by Earl. The ink matched a pen found in the Harper home. The envelope was postmarked, but never mailed. It had likely been placed in the deposit box in secret. The pocket knife next to the letter belonged to Earl. Family photos from the 1940s showed him carrying it on his belt. The initials carved into the wood matched his full name. This confirmed that the letter had come directly from him and had been preserved intentionally. Earl had tried to leave a record behind, a warning in case something went wrong. That warning had waited 21 years to be read. Sheriff Merritt expanded his investigation into Gregory's background. He worked with state officials to trace Gregory's movements from the time he had assumed the identity of Walter Greaves. Along the way, they found a fingerprint match from an old Army medical file. It confirmed that Gregory and Walter were indeed the same man. The final piece of evidence came from a birth certificate belonging to Gregory Harper, filed in Illinois in 1910. The certificate listed the names of Earl's parents and included a photo taken during enlistment. When matched against images of Walter Greaves from later in life, facial recognition confirmed what the letter had implied. Gregory Harper had never died in the fire. He had used the chaos to escape a troubled past and reinserted himself into his brother's life under a false name. The question remained as to why. No mental illness had ever been diagnosed. No prison time. Nothing in the record suggested a motive for such a cruel deception. But the facts stood. Gregory had been close to the Harpers. He had watched them. And at some point he had decided to end their lives and bury the truth. As Sheriff Merritt worked to bring closure to the case, he contacted a local historian who had spent years documenting unsolved cases from the region. She recalled a strange story passed down through old newspapers. In 1955, a deputy sheriff had been quietly dismissed from duty. At the time, the reason given was poor conduct. But when Merritt tracked down the archived disciplinary records, he found something more disturbing. The deputy had been caught falsifying death certificates and tampering with coroner reports. One of the altered documents was from the Harper case. The original coroner's note, long thought lost, was still attached to the file. The note read, "Temporary burial. Confirmed." No bodies recovered. It had been crossed out in red ink and replaced with the phrase, "presumed missing." The sheriff who signed off on the change had later acquired land under suspicious circumstances. It was possible that Gregory had paid or threatened officials to cover up the burial. At the very least, he had taken advantage of a broken system. The truth had been buried not just under the barn, but in documents and silence. Sheriff Merritt stood alone in the barn one last time before the structure was scheduled to be demolished. The wooden beams groaned in the wind, and sunlight poured through the broken slats in scattered shafts of light. Dust floated silently in the air. He walked across the floor that had once concealed the Harper family's resting place and stopped at the edge of the trapdoor that had been uncovered months before. The cellar below had since been cleared and sealed. A simple wooden cover replaced the old planks that had once hidden decades of silence and death. Merritt looked at the spot where he had first stood when the door was pried open. He remembered the smell of earth, the shock of seeing the remains lined up in the shadows, the rope, the bullet holes. It felt impossible that something so horrifying had been concealed beneath such a modest building. What troubled him most was not just the act of murder, but the patience and calculation it had required to hide it for so long. Gregory Harper had not simply committed a crime. He had rewritten a family's fate. He had manipulated documents, falsified identities, and buried a truth that only nature had been willing to reveal. Outside, a team of workers prepared the site for demolition. The barn had been deemed structurally unsafe. There were no objections from the town or the remaining relatives of the Harper family. They wanted closure. The property would be cleared, and a small memorial garden would be planted in its place. Sheriff Merritt had arranged for a local artist to carve a plaque using the old barn wood. It would list the names of Earl Margaret and Luke Harper. The design included a single tree and 3 birds in flight. Something peaceful, something final. He hoped it would be enough. As the crew began removing the first boards, Merritt walked the perimeter of the property. He followed the tree line where the first drawing had been found buried in a tin box. That image still haunted him. The boy with 3 eyes, the faceless man, the shovel. The psychologist had said the third eye represented awareness, a way of seeing what others could not. Luke had drawn that image with intention, perhaps as a warning, perhaps as a confession. No one would ever know exactly when or why he drew it, but the message had been received. Later that week, Merritt visited the only living relative of the Harpers. Her name was Ellen Barker. She was Earl's niece and had been just 17 when the family disappeared. Now in her 70s, Ellen lived quietly in a small house on the edge of town. She had followed the case closely since the bodies were found and had agreed to take part in the memorial ceremony. Merritt brought the original drawing to her in a sealed folder. She held it in her hands for a long moment before opening it. Her eyes welled with tears, but she did not cry. She said she remembered Luke as a quiet boy who always seemed thoughtful. She did not believe he had drawn the third eye for decoration. She believed it meant something deeper, a way of saying, "I know what you are," without needing to speak. She told Merritt she wanted the drawing to be included in a time capsule to be buried beneath the oak tree at the center of the new garden. He agreed. She placed the folded paper in a metal container and sealed it herself. She said Luke had seen something no one else had. That should not be forgotten. The memorial was held on a warm afternoon in September. A small group gathered at the edge of the field where the Harper home once stood. Local residents, former investigators, a few distant cousins. Sheriff Merritt stood before the group and spoke plainly. He told the story of what had happened not as a mystery, but as a memory. He recounted the lives lost, the decades of silence, the careful deceit that had stolen the Harper names from the world for more than 20 years. He did not focus on Gregory. He focused on Earl, who had tried to leave behind a warning, on Margaret, who had protected her son with quiet strength, and on Luke, who had drawn the truth in crayon and buried it where only time and rain could find it. The crowd remained silent as the time capsule was lowered into the ground. Soil covered it slowly. The oak tree's leaves shifted gently in the breeze. The plaque was revealed, names carved into weathered wood. Nothing elaborate, just a reminder that people had lived here, had loved here, had been lost here. That evening, as the sun dropped low and shadows stretched across the empty field, Merritt returned alone. He stood at the base of the oak tree and placed a hand on the soil where the time capsule had been buried. He thought about how much effort had gone into hiding what had happened. The lies, the forged documents, the silence from neighbors who had seen too little or chosen not to look deeper. It had taken a storm to lift the veil, a falling tree to break open the ground, and a child's drawing to speak louder than any confession. Merritt closed his eyes and felt the wind shift. In that quiet moment, he understood something that would stay with him long after he left the job. Justice is not always loud. Sometimes it comes slowly, piece by piece. It arrives when someone listens, when someone refuses to stop looking, when a third eye opens. If you found this story compelling, remember to like and subscribe for more mysteries that unravel with every chapter. Let us know in the comments what you think really happened to the Harper family and where in the world you are watching from. Your thoughts help us bring even deeper stories to life.